maybe 180 things written down for students to learn at a certain grade level. It's pretty ridiculous. I mean, what we need to figure out is what's most critical. And that may be the route to understanding something about STEM and the trial and error process. And they may study that industry to learn about engineering.
What if you turn hardship into grace, anger into serenity? Everything changes. Make your life a masterpiece. Welcome, I'm Yanik, your host, and now joining me, Dr. Christine Mason. Dr. Christine Mason is the founder of the Center for Educational Improvement and a clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry at Yale University School of Medicine. Welcome back, Dr. Mason. What a treat to have you back and to talk and discuss your newly published book, Becoming a Transformative Leader from the Inside Out, a guide for educators, published just in November 2025, exactly, by Bloomsbury Academic.
Yeah. So this is the book. And it was a joy to write. It was a journey to write. I wrote the book with Dr. Renee Owen, who is a professor at Southern Oregon University. And she does very similar work. So the two of us have really taken a heart-centered approach to this work. And I think we have a lot to offer that you won't find in traditional texts that look at leadership and even transformative leadership. I think we go beyond what others are saying.
Let's dive a little bit and give some context what made you ultimately become interested in leadership and specifically transformative leadership, because you do already outstanding work in terms of heart-centered learning and other things that you're doing in schools, really building programs and capacity in order for kids to flourish. So what was it that you ultimately decided to go increasingly more into leadership?
Well, part of it is we've always focused some on leadership. And at the center, we've said that, there's a lot of information that goes to teachers about what to do and how to implement change. And a lot that's done at the university level or at the national political level, the administration. But a lot of times those local leaders, like the building leaders, are left out. And I know from my experience over the years, I would find that many, many times innovations would be introduced by people at high national levels. And then they would think about teachers and what we need to do to make sure teachers understand, but they would skip over the building principle. So again, a lot of our work focuses on what happens not only with teachers in classrooms, but the bigger environment, the school building in particular. But sometimes we even go to the district level or the state level to look at leadership. But when it comes to transformative leadership in particular, let's think about this. If you focused on trying to implement change as an individual teacher, there's many reasons why that's not going to get a big payoff, right? You may do things in your classroom and feel like, wow, I'm on the right track. And then something comes down from somebody in the school district or at the building level that interferes with what you want to do. That's pretty fragmented when things are done that way. And I can remember some research that I did years and years ago with the National Association of Elementary School Principals, where we looked at social emotional learning. And we had a focus group at a conference and said, hey, how's it going? And we found, despite all the work that Castle and others have done, that many, many people at that point were implementing this almost haphazardly, I would say. So you'd have, and you think about your waves of professional development, right? There's a project that's trending. Someone comes in and you have your orientation in August. You may have follow up meetings, and it may be a big thing for a few months, maybe even a year. You check back a year or two later, and you may find that you have the 5 dedicated teachers who are doing this, and others aren't. And that's exactly what has happened a lot in the arena of social emotional learning or changing school climate and really thinking about what's best for kids. Um, and that's not going to work. One of our premises with heart centered learning and some of the earlier work I did was that there's so much violence in the world today that we're not going to get the systematic changes, the systemic changes that are needed by um, offering it at first grade level and fifth grade level. No, it needs to be pre-K through 12, every single grade, every single teacher. So if you think about school-wide approaches to discipline, these need to be implemented systematically so there's a consistency across grade levels, across classrooms, and it needs to be done over a period of years. And this isn't something where we can implement it for 3 years and the violence we have in our adult society will disappear. You know, I spoke with 2 people, and actually later today I'm speaking with one of our advisory board members about school shootings and what's going on. And I didn't even realize, she said that she's been working in California and she was delayed in responding to me because there'd been a shooting in Stockton, California. And one of the young people who was killed was one of the people that she'd been working with. So it's just like, wow. And here I am, part of the other work I do. I work with a group called We've Got Your Back on a program for school safety. It's a mindfulness approach, and it's right there in California. But, um, just bringing people together around these topics is so critical. And what do we do to network and to collaborate as we build up and out, even from the school community, and think about the space beyond the school?
That's brilliant. There are so many layers that you're touching on, and it's really tough work, obviously. But of course, it's also challenging when you want to actually enact systemic change, right? And I think the approach that you're taking here, I think it's the most reasonable one because it can actually be implemented and it will ultimately roll out, even though it might take much longer. It takes decades, let's say, or the mindfulness approach, right? But these are tangible results that you ultimately see, especially in changes in people's behavior, actions, and thinking, and really living. So that's very powerful. What does leadership feel like when it begins from within?
Well, let's think about this. Many times people come into leadership positions with a vision for what should change outside of themselves, right? We want to make sure that we have reduced disruptive incidents in schools, right? We want to make sure that our teachers are more compassionate. So when you start with the other, there's a lot of focus on what is needed, what other people need to do, and you become the person that does the supervision, right? The coordinator. You become the person who says, "Oh, this is the drum we have, and I want you to follow the drum that I'm beating." On the other hand, if you start with internal work, you get a greater understanding of what's needed for the change process. So if you think about something you're implementing in your school and what you know about the situation, maybe you're trying to increase cultural competence and you spend some time reflecting on your own cultural competence and you think about what you know, what you don't know, what do you need to know. It may be that you're going to approach it entirely different. You're going to personalize it more, certainly. You're going to have a greater understanding of timelines, of the yin and the yang, the push and the pull, and the factors that influence the change, because you're trying to do something to change your awareness, your skills, and your implementation too. So there's a lot to be said by just this whole internal process of saying, I as a leader know that I have things I need to work on too. Or you're going along, and you're feeling okay, things are going really fine, and then on the horizon comes something that's new, and you think about it, and you say, "Wow, I'd like to know more." And the spark of motivation changes some when you take that perspective of, what do I want to know, right? What do I need to know to make a change?
And it also looks like that you are to some extent in control. And that's what I always find is so difficult when it comes, for example, to activism, because usually you focus on the things that then don't work, right? And therefore, everything seems so out of control. And so also your emotions, your thinking, you are just not very clear. You lack on clarity and really what to do, especially where to start it all.
Yeah, you're right. So, again, how do you become more clear about what's needed? Um, and let me say something that's a little contradictory to this line of thinking, too. Okay, so if you come in as a leader, you have a vision, you think about what you want and what you experience. That's part of the equation, right? But the other part is who's around you, the whole context, the mindset, and our lens, our worldview. And in fact, I do some work with indigenous communities. And in our book, we talk some too about an indigenous worldview, which is more of a kinship view of the world. Like, how do we collaborate together in an organic way to make a change rather than, again, coming in my vision and I want you to go ahead and implement this for me? No, the collaboration is really critical, and getting the input, the buy in, the support of others is part of what leads to success, right? Because you want others to have the same heartfelt um, desire for the change that you have. And that means as you go back and forth and as you reflect on others and you learn from them, that your ideas may shift some too. As part of that whole internal process of growing and becoming more aware of what's needed, maturing probably beyond saying, oh, in a very simplistic fashion, we need better discipline. You know, no. Why do we need better discipline? What's the root cause of the concern? And how do we work with communities, which may extend beyond the school? Maybe families, it may be the business community, may be the ethnic groups in your community, it may be the political profile in your state or your district. All of that influences what happens. And you've got to take those things into account. Um, and if you don't, you may be, it's almost like pushing a rock up a hill, right? A boulder up a hill. Uh, yeah, it becomes more difficult because you are really trying to force something rather than organically figuring out, hey, here's how we work together to get this change.
How does this critical awareness really change the way you show up as a leader?
Okay, can you restate that? I'm not quite
S-
sure of your question.
Yeah, so how does this inner awareness that you're talking about from a leader's perspective by looking and collaborating with others really change the way you show up as a leader?
Okay. Well, I'll give you one example, and it's not going to resonate with everyone, but it's a current one I'm dealing with. Um, you know that we've been doing this heart centered work for a long time. I have uh, a person working with me who coordinates the work with a group of research fellows. And we were talking the other day, and she said, you know what? We need to do a scoping literature review. We need to find out on a research perspective what others are saying. And there's a whole set of protocol to be used to get this done. And I love it. It goes beyond what we've done. I've done meta analyses in the past. Um, and it actually goes beyond that. It's a little different twist on that. So you find out what others are saying, and um, and we can reflect on then the information we gain. We know that what we're doing with heart-centered learning at the center is different than just taking a social emotional approach to changing student behavior, to set up an environment and protocol to make sure there's better self-management, self-awareness, etc. We know because mindfulness is deeply a part of what we do, that in fact our approach is different than what other people are doing. I also know that periodically across the years, I'll come across somebody else who does something that's called maybe heart-centered education instead of heart-centered learning. We have some meditation, mindfulness approaches that are heart-centered. There's some work out there that's very similar, and it would be nice to take a more of an in-depth approach to learning about what others have done. Now, this came about because I listened to this coordinator, this graduate student who's working with me, and together we're coming up with a vision of what this might do and how this might help more people understand our work.
Yeah, that's brilliant. So just keep up doing your great work because it truly works, I can tell. What happens when leaders slow down instead of pushing forward?
Yeah. Well, again, when we're pushing forward, we have a set of sometimes artificial timelines. And many times these are in schools related to things like academic proficiency. We need to get test scores up, right? And if that is your main goal, you're ignoring a lot of human factors. And, I'm particularly distressed of what happened during COVID and as we came out of COVID, where in fact we had hundreds and thousands of schools that maintained really high academic standards and said that fourth graders need to be operating at a fourth grade level, even though we know that they didn't have normal third grade or second grade experiences. From a developmental perspective, we would expect that students who do not have normal experiences in second or third grade are probably going to end up being different in some ways than students who would go through our traditional second and third grade background experiences in schools. They didn't have the socialization, they missed out. Now, if we are tuned in to looking around us, looking at the context, reflecting on what's going on, dialoguing, even talking to the students, the children themselves, and asking them where their preferences are, observing their behaviors. I remember some of my early teaching was at a lab school at the University of Washington, and we were taught. We even had those one-way mirrors where you could go back and observe other teachers and what was going on. Um, and we were taught to really look to see not only what happened with the student at the desk with that learning, but it was happening around the student, and to reflect on not only what the student produced on the paper, but what the student said about his or her learning. Now that was a very valuable experience, just to have the flow of education guided by student interest, by student pacing, student understanding, depth of understanding. Compare that to a system where, in fact, we have benchmarks and remember the years where, in fact, we had curriculum guides, right? And you were supposed to be at a certain place by, you know, end of October. Make sure you're on page 302 of their text, right? Well, you know that certain students aren't going to master really critical material. We also know, at least I know this, that from just a common sense perspective, to have too many standards maybe 180 things written down for students to learn at a certain grade level. It's pretty ridiculous. I mean, what we need to figure out is what's most critical, right? And what's that critical pathway to learning? My perspective is that a lot of it is that we make sure that students have foundational learning and skills, right? And then we figure out at certain points that they don't need to learn everything in almost this rote manner, where in fact equally divided into 25 or 30 boxes of subtext we're going to make sure students master. No, we're going to say one student may be more interested in airplanes. And that may be the route to understanding something about STEM and the trial and error process. And they may study that industry to learn about engineering and how that works and how that trial process affects what we learn about information and our understanding of innovations and moving forward. Someone else may have a totally different interest. And so we can let student interests guide part of what happens in learning. We only do this when we pay a lot of attention to our students. And we learn from them as we figure out what's most important to teach. And I would say, as I say this, on the other hand, I've had, background as a resource teacher working with students with disabilities in integrated classrooms. And I can remember thinking some students just really lacked foundational skills. And, they weren't really good at basic math. So even as we figured out ways to compensate for that at the middle school level, we still went back and did some things because there's some pretty simple procedures you can use to increase rote learning and really get, basic math skills at a level that works. Because it's really a shame if someone conceptually begins to understand something but doesn't have the skills, the basic skill set, then to perform an accurate calculation. So that means you look at your students and you figure out the wisest way to use your time together, right?
Yeah, that's so important. I think it becomes more and more important, actually, foundational learning, really, because the more this AI and everything really goes, is that what really becomes the big challenge is finding a place for everyone in one way or another to really meaningfully contribute and collaborate with one another.
Absolutely. And as we do this, we're going to realize that there are these other circumstances that impact learning. It's not just what happens in your classroom, but it's what happens in the lives of the students. A certain percentage of students are traumatized, and those numbers are pretty high. You know, um, in a district where, in fact, you have just a kind of an average level of trauma, it may be a quarter of your students by the time they're in third grade will have experienced significant trauma. There could be a loss of a grandparent, a loss of a pet, you know, and it may be that some of these students go through short periods of trauma, but there are others who are impacted by intergenerational trauma, etc. If you put a student in an environment where there's more poverty, where there's cultural or racial or ethnic barriers, where in fact ICE is coming in and conducting raids in the community, the levels of trauma, fear, and anxiety, depression, drug abuse, substance use go up. And in those environments, we have to pay even more attention. Because what do we know? We know a lot about the brain, right? And how, if someone's been traumatized, there is this tendency in the brain to pay attention first to survival. That means the hypothalamus is going to maybe hijack the brain, and you would take those neurons that may normally be right there in the prefrontal cortex and be available for learning, academic learning, making decisions and judgment, are right there back at a lower level of the brain where, in fact, we're worried about, am I going to be safe? Am I going to be okay? Do I have to watch out? So you put a a child who's experienced trauma or maybe intergenerational trauma in a classroom, and all of a sudden that student has trouble learning as well. So then there's the background noise of the trauma combined with this fear of learning, where fear of failure, right? And sometimes self labels that students give themselves. I can't read, you know, uh, I'm stupid. And we've got to use a lot of care. So if we're trying to transform a school system where these are the background factors, our research on neuroscience tells us what? Let's work on safety first. Let's make sure that the teachers feel safe, the students feel safe, and that there's some comfort with maybe even joy or excitement about being present. And again, you can look back, we can all look back on our own learning experiences and think about those times when we were most excited, most pulled into our learning, and how that felt, what we did. And many of us may even have pursued careers or independent learning projects because of our interests. And some of the deepest learning, the most meaningful learning happens when we choose those projects for ourselves. On the other hand, think about those times where, in fact, you were bored, right? Uh, you could think about Vygotsky in that zone of learning, right? The ideal zone is one where, in fact, people are engaged, they're challenged, but not overwhelmed. So you have that middle ground, but then you have on the one end boredom, and on the other end, um, just too much. Your expectations for me right now at this moment are too high. You need to work with me. You need to be supportive. And if teachers understand that, if administrators understand that, the school culture shifts. It shifts from one of shoulds and oughts, right, to ones of what can we do together? How do we evolve together? What would we like? What vision do we have, right? And student engagement can increase under these circumstances. So for me, when I think about transformative leadership, it involves all these components. When we wrote the book, we started the first chapter with saying, hey, there's 4 things that are needed beyond anything else to be a transformative leader in a school situation. You need to have compassion, stability, hope, and trust. Okay? And we actually based some of this on a Gallup poll. And these are 4 things that followers most want from leaders. Okay? So think about this as a leader, you're going to want to have followers. So that means if, in fact, a teacher, who's usually a pretty good teacher, is having a rough patch in their life, you're going to have compassion. You're not going to have the same expectations for what they do day in and day out. If, in fact, you're at a school with a high degree of teacher turnover or leader turnover, the stability is missing. And so before you go ahead and develop this program for the next change, you need to make sure that the people in the building are comfortable with the fact that you're there for them and you're working on grounding them in the sense of their well-being. From that can spring hope. And over time, with that hope, you'll develop also a sense of trust because people will learn that you say what you mean what you say. And that means as a leader, when you have that hard news to present, something tough, that you're honest and straightforward as well at those times. Not an easy job. When you look at the school principal, many times it's a lot of putting fires out, right? You've got one crisis after another. You've got parents who are upset or angry over something. We've got incidents in the community. Um, we have the expectation of others in the community for what a school should do. And you can think about various things related to, again, to different cultural and ethnic groups in this country right now, what's going on. And in the midst of all this, you want to make sure you have a sense of stability, that school's about learning, that yes, the things you expect to have from school will be here with additional supports, nurturing, guidance, and trust. Um, and so it's talking the talk, but also walking the walk, right? And it means talking with your teachers and finding out, like, what do you need to make this shift or to make these changes? How can I support you? How do you want to be involved? How should we pace this? What's fair to ask right now? And sometimes it means delaying some of your gratification as a leader. You may have a plan in your mind that says you'd like to do this year, and you look at your plate and you say, okay, let's try to start something by January. We're gonna tiptoe into this, maybe working with a group of teachers, educators in your building who are most engaged, most interested, most available, rather than doing things with the whole group to begin with. Um, that's kind of tough. If you think about all the years of experience and education that you go through to become a building principal, you have all that background and you know kind of some of the things you'd like to see happen. Yet you enter a building and you've got to look at that history in the background. You've got to pay attention to all that context. And in the book, we talk about Peter Singe's work, and his thoughts about an organic approach. So really what we're doing is we're not just implementing something with a business model, right? Where we have a design that we overlay on the environment, but rather it springs up almost naturally, almost like growing a garden, right? You're going to do your planting and seeding of ideas, and then you're going to nurture them. And as you nurture, you're going to pay attention to what's happening and make adjustments. Um, and that really is the way nature works, right? Um, in the middle of all this, if we have a flood, we're going to have to adjust what's going on. And that flood could be a number of things in your environment. You could have incidents in your community. You could have something that's happening nationally that's causing more fear. You could have an increased use of substances. And we find this a lot in indigenous communities where, in fact, when kids get to be middle school level, substance abuse is so high um, that it becomes almost overwhelming to think about what you do to help prevent that, to help nurture kids so that, in fact, they don't go that route. Um, and we know within communities, when you see an increase in substance abuse, if you look at what's going on in the community, many, many times you'll find higher unemployment levels, um, job loss, right? And people who are living with a sense of despair. So you escape into the drugs. Same thing with youth. So what can we do so that, in fact, school becomes more exciting and supportive? And I think a lot of the transformative work that's needed is right at that level. How do we help students stay engaged?
What is some of the biggest challenges to really cultivate and implement from a leader's perspective, compassion, hope, stability, in a school? What is the biggest challenge?
I was thinking about that today. I was thinking about our discussion. And I believe one of them has to do with communication, one of the biggest challenges. Because let's say you have good ideas, but you're not an effective communicator. Your message may not get to the people you're trying to connect with. Or on the other hand, you're a communicator, you're good at talking, but maybe not so good at listening. Uh, and so you may not pay attention to those subtle signs, whether somebody comes to talk to you privately, or you notice that um, just people aren't paying as much attention at the professional development staffing, right? they don't seem to be as engaged. So if you're not listening to those signs, not paying attention, not listening to families in your community, it's going to be really difficult to implement an effective program. I believe we have a wealth of ideas. Most of us come into the position again with a lot of these ideas. And in many, many buildings, most buildings, we have a wealth of talented staff. And our students, brilliant students, I don't care which students you're talking about, they're all brilliant. They really are. I mean, the way our minds work during those developmental years, it's amazing. So then what is it that prevents us from being effective? Listening, communicating, and really this mindful awareness, right, of what's going on around us so that we can um, lead in a way that is meaningful and kind of fits the needs of your community right at the moment.
Unpack a little bit the connection between communication and connection. How do they somehow interrelate together? So, in order for you to communicate effectively, you also have to be able to connect to someone. And how does this actually unfold? Unpack this.
Good point. That really is. That sense of belonging is really critical for a school too. So that if you have teachers who are detached, students who are not engaged, that's the milieu, the environment you have. It's going to be really hard to be an effective communicator. You've got to work on that sense of trust. When you find detachment and disengagement, a lot of times you'll find a lack of trust, a lack of a sense of hope, and people who, and you've seen this, teachers who, you know, have been in the classroom for 30 years and they're just taking the paycheck, right? I mean, they're there because that's where they were certified and, so be it. Yeah, so what do you do in those situations? You try to figure out, like, how can you help people feel a sense of belonging? And you can think about a student maybe who's experienced a trauma, perhaps a mental health episode, is, you know, been hospitalized, is coming back to school, and I'm sure is feeling alienated, right? And feeling like, wow, there's nothing here for me. What can I do? Um, so, how do you encourage somebody in these circumstances? Well, some of it's one on one dialogue, right? I mean, some things you just cannot do in a group. So, recognize that if I was communicating with um, a group of teachers and realizing that there were several who were really turned off, I would try to find one or two people to talk to, and you try to build your network of support. And in a way that doesn't betray the confidence of others, doesn't say anything that would be damaging to anyone. Got to be really careful with your words. You don't want to put someone in a situation that might compromise their sense of fellowship with their peers. But nonetheless, you might even establish formal uh, groups to help you. You were going to have the visionings group who's going to help develop a new vision for the school for what we want it to be next year. So you figure out ways to pull people in and engage them, ways to get the community involved. And you want some wins. And what we say to principals, when we're mentoring them early on is you need a few good, strong wins in that first 6 months. Yeah. So that means you may pick some things where you know it's going to be a little easier to get good results and that people will be particularly appreciative of the results. So you may not start with the thing that's number one on your list, but rather listen to your community and create that sense that, hey, I've heard you. And see, your trust is building. When that trust builds, then you have a better sense of someone feeling a part of the community. um, whether it's students or staff.
Yeah, it's brilliant. And I really appreciate that you bring this up, because oftentimes these are also people who were really profoundly hurt, right? That they somehow, were silently quitting basically. But oftentimes it's not necessarily that it's not willfully, but it's truly that they are at the very core not really taken seriously for whatever reasons, right? And so to really bring them back with a compassionate, with a hopeful, trustworthy approach, really, and also to foster this stability, right, for this person is so critical. What made you convinced that this is the approach to go forward when it comes to transformative leadership, especially in schools?
Well, I have to give a lot of credit to my co-author, Renee Owen, the lead author on this book. I mean, she's brilliant. She really is. And she's done a lot of work in school communities. So only in the last few years has she become a professor. Before, she was a principal or an executive director of schools, where in fact they did a lot of things that are very heart-centered and very compassionate approaches to learning. So because she's had such great experiences and success, I've listened to her and we figured out like what's the meaning underneath all of this and what can we do to proceed. So that's part of it. And then I think the other part is just simply um, probably all these life experiences I've had, right? People I've met, interacted with, and the research we've done. A part of our work in considering a transformative leader is to look at visioning. And you may know I wrote a book years ago on visioning onward. And at that point, we looked at successful businesses, Microsoft, Apple, Starbucks, etc., and said, what did those leaders do? How did they lead? What were their visions like? So we done some study, some research, right? The research not only what happens in schools, but it's transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary research, where you go beyond your academic area of study. You look at businesses and you look at what makes success. And with that research, we came up with like 8 steps, would you believe, for visioning. And I won't go through all 8, but I will say it's an iterative process. And it begins with an environmental scan, maybe maybe talking with a small group of people and just sharing informally what are your visions and thinking about it, getting a trusted group that's working with you, and then continuing to scan. But you don't stop with your first vision, which is a lot of times what happens. You have strategic planning, you come up with your strategic plan, and it's there and shelved, and a lot of times filed away in the file cabinet, and not much is done till the year passes by, and you could go through your review and you can say, okay, we met or didn't meet the objectives. Um, we don't recommend that way. We say make it iterative. So it means that, in fact, you work with a group of people, you expand the group of people who are helping you with the vision. And as you shape that vision and your goals, you make sure that you go then to some of the outliers. I mean, when we think about change, a lot of times you talk about early adopters, late adopters, mid level. And we know this, that you're not going to focus a lot of your effort on the late adopters. If you do that, it's too hard. And you have the other people. I always like to think about the people that are close to the ceiling and what would happen if we just gave them a little boost. What happens, I believe, is everything is boosted upwards. So that I love working with some of the really talented leaders we have in our schools and making sure that they're engaged, whether it be students or teachers, staff. But then you'll have those who are just below that level. And with a little encouragement and maybe a little peer encouragement, they may elevate what they're doing to that next level. And so that may be the culture of the school, that a lot of attention is focused there. Um, and frankly, there are going to be some people you maybe can't do much about, which is hard. It's hard to recognize that. And what do you do? But At a certain point, the rubber meets the road. And at a certain point, you may have the confidence, the support of a group to say, hey, in this school, these are our guidelines, our operating principles. And let me know, can you hop on board? Or are you here with me? Are you engaged with this level? And if not, it may not be the right school for you, might not be the right fit. So we recognize that we're not going to change everyone, right?
Yeah, so true. That's beautifully said, really. Just talk a little bit about your journey to heart-centered learning, because I find it's always so interesting how you found your passion and really your purpose of doing what you are doing now.
Okay, go back a few dozen years. We founded CEI, a Center for Educational Improvement, in 2009. And I would have to say, go back to my childhood, probably. I mean, and what I always wanted to do when I thought about being a teacher or a psychologist, I wasn't sure which it was going to be, depends on the year, um, that compassion was important. I saw examples of teachers when I was a student where I was just appalled at the lack of compassion for students. And that really always bothered me. Um, and then I can think about when we first integrated students with disabilities into regular mainstream education. This was in the 70s, right? We passed legislation with due process, etc. And I ended up coordinating a couple of grants where we worked special education and general education together to try to figure out, like, how do we make this a good, inclusive, welcoming environment. So I've stayed with that philosophy, and we've built on that philosophy over the years. But in 2009, I was kind of between grants. Most of my um, life, I've lived off of soft money. I've been in positions where, in fact, we had to bring in money to be funded. And I was working with charter schools in DC. We had a beautiful project, two beautiful projects, lost funding on one of them. And I thought, what do I do? Well, I'm also a yoga teacher. And I'd been chairing an education committee for this international yoga community. And we'd been going to a school in India, and I'd made like 3 trips there um, to supervise. And we were teaching some of the Indian teachers some of our Western procedures, some of the things we're talking about in terms of student engagement and agency and, yeah, paying attention to student interests. And I was there as an interim principal, which gave me 6 months to really learn more about Indian philosophy and education. And of course, I knew quite a bit by then because I'd been studying yoga for probably 20 years at that time, not really deeply involved. I've been teaching now since 2001, teaching three to 5 classes a week, and doing everything else. Okay. But nonetheless, I looked at what was happening at the school. I knew what the philosophy was, what the underpinnings were, and thought, how do I bring this back to the United States? And I knew in 2009, 2010, taking yoga into schools was not the thing to do. I mean, no way would that be understood. But I thought, what can I do that comes close? And I really thought the philosophy was really critical. And this was the philosophy of compassion and heart-centered learning. The 5 C's come from those experiences and kind of sifting through and synthesizing and saying, if we could only teach students 5 things and focus on 5 components, what would be most critical? And I know other people have their 4 C's or 5 C's or whatever they are, the R's or, you know, however, I've actually, one of my books did a little comparison with like Fullen's 5 C's, I think. And he has creativity involved, which is cool. I really like those too. But I will say, these 5 C's still seem to make sense. There's research strongly supporting each one of them. That sense of community, for example, that sense of belonging is really critical. If we just focus on social emotional learning and not on community building, we're not doing what's needed because we are social creatures learning in social environments. So we really should have that sense of community. If we leave out courage, we've left out something that's really major. Many SEL programs leave out courage, they don't focus on it. Um, you have to have that courage to take the risks that are needed to evolve, to become. We talk in this book, becoming a transformative leader, about becoming and what becoming means. It's an active verb, and it means that we're not taking this one and done approach. It's not that we have goals and we reach them, but no, it's a continual evolution, so that we realize that with the 5 C's, you can continue to have that evolution. And the evolution of courage is important when you're up against, really difficult, challenging situations, and you have to make the best decision. So you need some confidence, another of the C's, right? You need that sense of compassion. I mean, even if you go back to religious scriptures, the Bible, whatever, compassion's really high on that list. Um, so can you imagine being part of a community where compassion wasn't one of the highest values? It doesn't make sense. It really doesn't. Um, there's even research, they'll say that if you've been traumatized yourself, one of the easiest, best things to do to live through your trauma and get past it is to think about compassion for others. And that might be part of like a gratitude journal, you know, every day, like, what am I grateful for? Or maybe taking on a project to help others. It gets you out of yourself so that each of these become what we think are most critical. And unfortunately, we're right in the middle of this research. The Compassionate School Leadership Academy, that was the project with Yale and was funded by Department of Ed, when in fact, like many other projects across the country, our funding was pulled. So now I'm back at the point of, what do we do on a shoestring? How do we get other funding to support this? And I have to say, I'm really grateful to the foundations right now. Many of them are stepping up. The monies aren't as large as what we would have from the federal government, but nonetheless, there's some evidence that there are foundations out there that realize that we need to focus on diversity and equity. I mean, and inclusion. Those things are really critical to the future, to the present time for students and educators and for all of us. And it's not a time to turn our back on people who have greater needs, but rather to figure out, like, how do we support each other? So, does that tell a little of the story?
Brilliant. And I can't agree more because it's also learning. It's really a process of being courageous, right? To take these steps and be willing to fail, because that's how we can just build up our confidence by failing time and again. And we just gradually build up and lose the fear of really making mistakes. And in doing so, you really need courage. So important. How come that so many teachers still have a hard time of accepting or of letting students making mistakes, for example in terms of exams, right? I mean, if you foster a classroom climate who really puts forward compassion, hope, trust and stability, and who facilitates the process of making mistakes and being part of learning and actually rewarding it to some extent, precisely in order for us to foster courage and stability. What is the problem? Why is there a fear that students should not get another chance for writing, for example, an exam?
Mm. Well, if we held a focus group with educators and we asked that question, or with leaders, you know, I think we'd hear a variety of things. And a lot of it has to do with systems and tradition, right? This is this educational system. These are the rules, the principles, the guidelines. These are our expectations. And I've often said, you know, many people think they know about schools because they went to school. It's not like you chose a job as an engineer and people don't know much about it, so you can kind of carve out your pathway. Heavy duty expectations on schools to function as schools in a traditional sense. And so anytime you try to do something that deviates from that pattern, you're going to get pushback. Okay. And if you think about the types of changes we're talking about, some ways they're not only evolutionary, they're revolutionary, right? I mean, yeah, there's a little bit of the rebel in me that says, hey, uh, we shouldn't just keep doing what we've done in the past. We need to go forward. We need to take advantage of what we know about careers in the future, the society, the planet, what's going on. What do we need leaders for? You know, what do we need leaders to be? And then we need to problem solve together because there are humongous problems out there, huge, gigantic. And we need youth to be the problem solvers, right? So we need the very best brains working as efficiently as possible, as collaboratively as possible, so that in fact we get the most brilliant solutions and we get the support for them. And so I think in some ways that's a redesign, reimagining education. Okay. And that means more student agency. And it means teachers are coaches. This is my pie in the sky, right? Dream for the future. That's where I would have us go so that we're learning together. There's not the artificial barrier. Teacher teaches and students learn. No, teachers learn too, and students teach. But we have people whose mindsets are deeply affected by the past, by tradition, by systems, and then I would say the lack of leadership. If you wanted to say, like, who are the educational leaders today? We still have educational researchers out there who are doing some amazing research. But at the national level, at the international level, uh, where are they? You know, um, what is being done that's brilliant in any of those circles? There's still brilliance in the research and in innovations and in special projects, but try to scale that up. And we even have people who are brilliant, like a Michael Folland, who for years have told us what we need to do to scale things up. And he wrote a book several years ago with a colleague on spirit work. So he and I are on a similar path, saying, hey, there's a moral, the ethical responsibility we have to make changes. And we need more people to understand that. But that takes leadership. And it takes a willingness to change, a willingness to go to bat, right? For things that will sometimes be uncomfortable. Because as we say in the book, there isn't always comfort with change. There's sometimes stretching yourself and experiencing that discomfort. And of course, those cycles of change where there's storming and norming and all that. You had that honeymoon at the beginning, right? You come in and people say, okay, let's see what happens. And then you start to work with the group and you're okay for a while. And then you start to have disagreements. And how those are handled really impacts what happens next with any change. So you have to figure out how to help people get through that storming part of the change cycle where guidance is needed, leadership is needed. So I would say we're not doing a good enough job in cultivating leadership either, right? I mean, frankly, if this was our one and only planet, let's just pretend like all the people we know in the whole universe live on Earth. Just pretend, right? And we're concerned about the future. You think there'd be billions of dollars invested in youth and getting youth to help us situate a better future. You think there'd be billions of dollars spent on what we do to make the Earth a healthier planet, you know. Uh, so something's really amiss, right?
Why is courage so difficult, especially in uncertain times?
You know, well, the impact can be tremendous, right? You speak out, you could be fired. I mean, there's a lot of risk that's involved. You know, you could get a poor performance review, right? If you're a teacher in your classroom and there's a protocol that you don't agree with and you ethically are having difficulty following, you risk, you know, being called in and being told, in this school, this is the protocol we follow. So as a leader, same thing holds true. What's the district doing? And what do we know? We know at the district level, I remember some workshops I was in, and when I was with the Elementary School Principals Association, we did some things with a foundation out of New York, and we were looking at mid-level supervisors and trying to figure out like what's going on there, what's needed. And they worked with 3 or 4 districts across the country to increase the relevance and the impact of mid-level supervisors. One of the things you had to do is you had to get them back in touch with schools because many times you advance, from being sometimes the coach to the principal to a curriculum specialist to somebody else. And when you're at that higher level, you may lose touch with kids and teachers, with schools. Um, and so you sometimes forget about what's needed. So, it does take courage. And if we don't have people in these mid level positions who have courage, it puts more responsibility on the people in the building level, right? And there's more risk. Now, if you have a really, really innovative superintendent, and I find quite a few superintendents who are brilliant, there's a lot of brilliance at the level of the superintendent. Okay. Then you still have everybody in these other positions who have to consider what the expectations are. Who do you report to? What are the protocol? What are the guidelines? What are the rules? How's the community going to react? So there's all these factors impinging on what you do and how you do it. Now, if above the level of the district superintendent, you have someone at the state level or the national level who has a vision for the future, for this one and only planet, right? Um, you're in luck, right? Because that means it takes less courage because people are going to be more willing to accept innovations, to expect that as you have innovations, it's not all perfect. It's not a straight line growth, right? What you have is ups and downs, and it's just like engineering, right? You're going to have some errors along the way. That happens with innovation. You have to recognize that when those errors occur, you're going to make adjustments, refinements, and you move on. If you're a researcher, you pretty much know that, and that's the way you operate. But people who are trained as administrators don't always have that same mindset, that same training. So that, in fact, keeping people with you as you're implementing change is also a leadership issue, right?
Yeah, it's so hard. I mean, there's a whole science on just the implementation, and that's a whole other level, of course. What shifts when leadership becomes relational rather than hierarchical?
Okay. Well, you think about it, hierarchy. As a hierarchy, you'd have transactions. you'd have expectations. You would think, I'm going to make decisions, and at other levels, people will implement them, whether it's mid-level supervisors, the level of the district, principals, teachers, students. It's almost like one-way communication. Relational means that you realize there's common human elements here. You know, people are going to need grace. There's going to be a need for compassion. There are going to be times when people will be jealous. There will be times when people feel hurt or left out. There'll be times when people are stressed out. There'll be times when you're stressed out. And so relational means that we consider all those human elements and we factor those in and say, okay, now what do we do? Sometimes we oversimplify our problems and our solutions. You know, we try to develop this approach and diagram it, right? But there's a lot of complexity there. In our book, we show a nested approach. We start with from the inside out, you know, yourself, your school, the community around you, the larger society, etc. And we like to think about how we all things interact together, but you focus a lot on yourself so that you have a good central core and you build that central core of leadership in your staff and your students, right? But you still have all those other things happening. So you're going to have to pay attention. You can't just focus on your school, right? I mean, it's the back and forth, it's the relationships.
Who are we becoming as we lead from the inside out at the personal level and really from your perspective?
Okay. From my perspective, I'm going to make this very personal to begin with, okay? I remember when Michelle Rivers Murphy and Yvette Jackson and I wrote the first book in this whole series on mindfulness, heart-centered learning. And we would dialogue, and Michelle and I would get on the phone probably once a week for a couple of years, okay? And we challenged ourselves to think about, let's just focus this week on compassion. And just notice when compassion occurs in your environment. Or you could have courage. What do you hear about courage? And we just wanted to increase our awareness and see what would happen. Well, you can well imagine if you speak about this thousands of times, you better live it, right? If you're not living it, it's not honest, it's not authentic. So for me, heart centered learning became heart centered living, essentially, right? The, it, I had a set of principles I needed to live by. And by living them, it's easier to teach others about them. It just fits. And the really cool thing for me is by doing all this, I brought together my love of education and learning. And, you know, when I did my doctoral work, I studied learning, essentially. Back in those days, I was interested particularly in individuals with severe disabilities and wanted to know more about their learning. This is back in the 70s. And there weren't really a lot of classes. So we studied the psychology of learning and looked at animals and brain research, da, 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 da. And it was a fascinating path to learn about how do you teach. You think about people make mistakes, animals make mistakes. There's rewards and punishments, et cetera, et cetera. So that for me, the learning became a way of thinking about others and their learning, right? And analyzing, looking at learning and thinking about if a student makes a mistake, like what's going on. And I don't know if you ever did anything called an error analysis. I remember an early book I wrote way back, wow, in the 70s with co-authors. And it's actually on assessment. And we would say, if a student makes an error, you need to dialogue or diagram out possible reasons for the error and think about, was it environmental home factors? Was it the student lacked basic skills? Was it a miscalculation? Was it the student got distracted? Was it the student has disruptive behavior? Right? Or did I not teach? Maybe there's something foundational missing. And that whole thing has stayed with me, right? Looking at how people learn and then thinking about how you'd like people to live, right? If you do that deep inner analysis, you say, how do I want to live? And for me, some of it is doing more and more of what I like to do and less of things that I don't like so much, right? With any job, there's going to be things that you really aren't your fondest things, right? I'm not as fond of some things as others. But if I live by, hey, what can I do? So I spend more and more of my time doing things I love. You know what that means? It means I'm probably a more pleasant person to be around, right? I have less of a chance that I'm going to need to vent someplace, right? That I'm going to feel exhausted at the end of the day, that Monday will roll around and I don't want to come to work because I'm doing what I love, which to me is heart-centered living.
Do what you love. This is heart-centered living. This is brilliant, Dr. Mason. What a blessing. Last question. What's really for you, according to you, the biggest takeaway of becoming a transformative leader from the inside out?
It's probably heart connections. You mentioned the word connection earlier when I was talking about communication. My heart is certainly much bigger than it used to be, right? Definitely. And I wouldn't say I'm the most compassionate person. There's many people out there much more compassionate than I, because I have really high standards, expectations. But nonetheless, I try to go down to my heart and consider what my heart is telling me as well as my mind. And again, there's research supporting that if my heart enters into my decision, I'm likely to make a better decision. In one of our books, we talk about this. It's heart coherence. So that, in fact, if I walk into a room and see someone who is so good to see them, oh, I'm so excited. That just changes the nature of that whole interaction, that whole being in this room together with people. There's somebody I love right across the room and I'm seeing them. Same thing, you walk into a classroom and you see students you love. You're teaching something you love, right? So that heart connection to what we're doing helps us be more authentic and really get outside of ourselves so we're not stuck in our own little mind and what's going on, you know?
And it's really contagious. I can really tell this by the time you are talking about this. It really it makes you feel very differently. And therefore, it goes really, as you said, from inside out. And wonderful. Yes. Dr. Chris Mason, thank you so much again for being truly a blessing to myself and really to the world.
And Yanik, thank you for having me.
Dr. Chris Mason. That's why knowledge matters. Make your life a masterpiece. Visit now programs.the-ykm.com.